Hello everybody, and welcome back to the Anarchist audio library. Today we're going to be continuing where we left off with part 2 of With Allies Like These, Reflections on Privilege Reductionism, written by Common Cause Ottawa, published June 6, 2014. Three, Implications. Championing individual over collective action. While anti-oppression theory acknowledges that power relations operate at both the micro and macro level, it places a disproportionate focus on the level of individual interactions. Emphasis is placed on individual conduct and personal improvement, with little attention given to challenging oppression at a structural level. Widely used by activist groups and NGOs, the document Principles and Practices of Anti-Oppression is a telling example of this trend. The statement describes the operation of oppression and outlines steps for challenging the unequal distribution of power, solely in terms of individual behavior. It puts forth the following suggestions for confronting oppression. Quote, keep space open for anti-oppression discussion. Be conscious of how your language may perpetuate oppression. Promote anti-oppression in everything you do. Don't feel guilty, feel motivated, unquote. In a similar vein, the popular blog Black Girl Dangerous, in a recent post 4 Ways to Push Back Against Your Privilege, offers a simple 4-step model. The first step is to make the choice to relinquish power. If you are in a position of power, relinquish this position. Step 2 is just don't go. If you have access to something and you recognize that you have it partly because of privilege, opt out of it. The third step is to shut up. If you're an individual of privilege who is committed to anti-oppression, you will sit the hell down and shut up. And finally, step 4 is to be careful with the identities that you claim. The strategy for ending oppression is articulated as a matter of addressing power dynamics between individuals in a group context, but within the confines of the state and capitalism. For the privileged subject, struggle is presented as a matter of personal growth and development, the act of striving to be the best non-oppressive person that you can be. An entire industry is built on providing resources, guides, and trainings to help people learn to challenge oppression by means of, quote, checking their privilege, unquote. The underlying premise of this approach is the idea that privilege can be willed away. At best, this orientation is ineffective, and at worst, it can actually work to recenter those who occupy positions of privilege at the expense of wider political struggle. Andrea Smith, reflecting on her experiences with anti-oppression workshops, describes this issue. Quote, these workshops had a bit of a self-help orientation to them. I am so-and-so and I have X privilege. It was never quite clear what the point of these confessions were. It did not appear that these individual confessions actually led to any political projects to dismantle the structures of domination that enabled their privilege. Rather, the confession became the political project themselves, unquote. Resulting in what Smith terms the ally-industrial complex, the approach of challenging oppression via the confession of one's privilege leads to a valorization of the individual actions of a, quote, confessing subject, unquote. Acknowledging the ways in which structures of oppression constitute who we are and how we experience the world through the allocation of privilege is a potentially worthwhile endeavor. However, it is not in and of itself politically productive or transformative. Privilege is a matter of power. It equates benefits, including access to resources and positions of influence, and can be considered in terms of both psychological or emotional benefits, as well as economic or material benefits. It is much more than personal behaviors, interactions, and language, and can neither be wished nor confessed away. The social division of wealth and the conditions under which we live and work shape our existence and cannot be transformed through individual actions. We must organize together to challenge the material infrastructure that accumulates power, one result of which is privilege. Anything less leads to privilege reductionism, the reduction of complex systems of oppression whose structural basis is material and institutional to a mere matter of individual interactions and personal behaviors. Relentless articulation of difference. As a component of anti-oppression politics, intersectionality accounts for the complexity of domination by outlining the various ways in which different forms of oppression intersect and reproduce each other. Rooted in feminist discussions of the 1970s and 1980s that sought to problematize the notion of universal quote-unquote womanhood, intersectionality provides a framework for conceptualizing the ways in which different quote-unquote positionalities, e.g. gender, sexuality, race, class, ability, etc., shape people's subjective experiences, as well as material realities. Patricia Hill Collins describes intersectionality as an, quote, analysis claiming that systems of race, social class, gender, sexuality, ethnicity, nation, and age form mutually constructing features of social organization, unquote. In sum, intersectionality provides a lens through which we can view people's social locations as mutually constitutive and tied to systemic inequalities. Intersectionality is often evoked in a manner that isolates and reifies social categories without adequately drawing attention to common ground. Crucial to its analysis is an emphasis on a politics of difference. It is asserted that our identities and social locations necessarily differentiate us from those who do not share those identities and social locations. So, for example, a working-class queer woman will not have the same experiences and, by extension, the same interests as an affluent woman who is straight. Similarly, a cis man of color will not have the same experiences and, by extension, the same interests as a trans man of color, and so on and so forth. Within this framework, difference is the fundamental unit of analysis and that which precedes and defines identity. This practice works to isolate and sever connections between people in that it places all of its emphasis on differentiation. There are seemingly endless combinations of identities that can be articulated. However, these articulations of difference do not necessarily get at the root of the problem. As Collins argues, quote, quite simply, difference is less a problem for me than racism, class exploitation, and gender oppression. Conceptualizing these systems of oppression as difference obfuscates the power relations and material inequalities that constitute oppression, unquote. It is absolutely true that our social locations shape our experiences and may influence our politics. Acknowledging difference is important, but it's not enough. It can obscure the functioning of oppression and act as a barrier to collective struggle. The experiences of a female migrant who works as a live-in caregiver will not be the same as a male worker who has citizenship and works in a unionized office. These differences are substantial and should not be ignored. However, in focusing only on difference, we lose sight of the fact that both are exploited under capitalism and have a shared interest in organizing to challenge capital. To be clear, this is not to say that divisions can be put aside and dealt with, quote, after the revolution, unquote, but to highlight the importance of finding common ground as a basis to bridge difference and organize collectively to challenge oppression. In the words of Shireen Razak, quote, speaking about difference is not going to start the revolution, unquote. Moving beyond a politics of difference, we need an oppositional politics that seeks to transform structural relations of power. The subcultural ghetto and lifestyleism. The culture of anti-oppression politics lends itself to the creation and maintenance of insular activist circles, a so-called, quote, radical community, unquote, consisting of collective houses, activist spaces, book fairs, etc., premised on anti-oppression politics, fashions itself as a refuge from the oppressive relations and interactions of the outside world. This notion of quote-unquote community, along with anti-oppression politics' intense focus on individual and micro-personal interactions, disciplined by quote-unquote call-outs and privilege checking, allows for the politicization of a range of trivial lifestyle choices. This leads to a bizarre process in which everything from bicycles to gardens to knitting are accepted as radical activity. Call-out culture and the fallacy of community accountability creates a disciplinary atmosphere in which people must adhere to a specific etiquette. Spaces then become accessible only to those who are familiar with and able to express themselves with the proper language and adhere to the dominant customs. Participation in the discourse which shapes and directs this language and customs is mostly up to those who are able to spend too much time debating on activist blogs, or who are academics or professionals well versed in the dialect. As mentioned previously, the containment of radical discourse to the university further insulates the, quote, activist bubble, unquote, and subcultural ghetto. In addition to creating spaces that are alienating to those outside of our milieu, anti-oppression discourse, call-out culture, and the related quote-unquote communities leads activists to perceive themselves as an enlightened section of the class, largely composed of academics, students, professionals, etc., who have worked on their shit and checked their privilege, who are tasked with acting as missionaries to the ignorant and unclean masses. This anarchist separatist orientation is problematic for any who believe in the possibility of mass liberatory social movements that are capable of actually transforming society. One example of this orientation is a recent Tumblr blog maintained by Toronto activists entitled "Colonialism Ain't Fashionable." The blog encourages activists to use their smartphones to snap photos of people wearing Hudson Bay jackets in public and submit them. Hudson Bay is a Canadian retailer which played a historically significant role in colonialism, and the jacket, in particular, is seen by activists as an example of cultural appropriation. Photos are then published in a strange act of attempted public shaming, justified with some high-minded language about, quote, challenging colonialism at a cultural level, unquote, or sparking discussion. What we actually see on display here is the arrogant glee with which those within the activist bubble shake their finger at those outside of it. The retreat to subcultural bohemian enclaves and activist bubbles acknowledges that revolutionary change is impossible and as a substitute offers a counterfeit new society in the here and now. We understand that such a proposition is appealing given the day-to-day indignity and suffering that is life under our current conditions, but time and time again we have seen these experiments implode on themselves. Capitalism simply does not offer a way out, and we must face this reality as the rest of the class that we are a part of faces it every day. No amount of call-outs or privilege checking will make us into individuals untainted by the violent social relationships that permeate our reality. Privilege, militancy, and implicit pacifism. As a pacifying feature of anti-oppression politics, the assertion is frequently made that militancy is a luxury for the privileged. In the context of a meeting in which a militant action is proposed, proponents of anti-oppression politics will often critique the proposal on the basis that only those with X or Y privilege can participate in such an action. Due to the increased risks associated with militant action, it is argued that confrontational politics are largely the domain of those who occupy a social location of privilege, mainly cis men. This line of argument is then used to criticize confrontational actions as exclusionary and to gender such actions as masculine, i.e., the framing of a tactic as manarchist. For example, the Autonomous Workers Group notes that Black Bloc actions in their city of Portland are often critiqued on the basis of furthering a, quote, mentality of masculine white privilege, unquote. In a similar vein, another article critiques property destruction and illegal strike action, stating, "There are many problems with this. Some people cannot get arrested, immigration status or compromise of professional licensing. Other issues that warrant consideration are people who may have had traumatic experiences around violence or the police or both. People with health issues, mental or physical, may also not be able to participate in these kind of actions." Noting that it is not feasible for everyone to participate in high-risk actions, the article concludes that peaceful protest provides an opportunity for anyone, regardless of privilege, to participate. The end result of this logic is an aversion to risk that breeds an implicit pacifism. The avoidance of risk is a logical impossibility. To engage in revolutionary struggle is necessarily to put yourself at risk. To be against capital, the state, colonialism, white supremacy, patriarchy, etc. is to declare yourself an enemy of these systems. Risk, discomfort, conflict are unavoidable. The history and ongoing reality of resistance movements is radically unsafe. Furthermore, for a lot of people, simply going through their daily life is not safe. Marginalized communities aren't safe going about their daily lives because of institutions of oppression, police, prisons, individual and systemic violence, etc. To ignore this reality is to abandon revolutionary organizing. Jackie Wong notes, quote, "Removing all elements of risk and danger reinforces a politics of reformism that just reproduces the existing social order," unquote. If we accept that A, confrontation is relegated to privileged social positions, and that B, inclusivity is an uncompromising imperative, it follows that pacifism is the only acceptable approach to struggle. There exists an essential contradiction. Within the framework of anti-oppression politics, it is only the most oppressed who are considered to be legitimate actors in struggle. The role of the privileged is the ally. Yet, it is argued that militancy is for the privileged alone. Thus, the only option available is passive resistance, the framing of confrontational forms of resistance as belonging to the realm of privilege acts to relegate necessary tools, actions, tactics, strategies, etc., to a domain that is inaccessible. It reinscribes rather than challenges the unequal distribution of power in society, acts to erase militant histories in which oppressed peoples have engaged in violent resistance, and further thrusts a role of hapless victim onto those who are oppressed. There is nothing liberatory about this. 4. Moving forward. We have identified the current regime of anti-oppression politics as inadequate in providing a way forward in the task of developing a revolutionary movement capable of meaningfully challenging systems of oppression and exploitation. Not only are these politics inadequate, but ultimately regressive and counterproductive. Attempts to address the inadequacies of anti-oppression are often met with accusations of class reductionism. While we acknowledge that class reductionism exists as an incorrect political orientation, the accusation of such can be used as a strawman attack on those who transgress the dominant discourse within anarchist or radical circles. Reducing the class. As an actual political orientation, class reductionism can be largely described as a tendency on the left which prioritizes the economic struggle in the workplace as the primary terrain of revolutionary or progressive action. Often, this will go further to fetishize a particular segment of workplace struggle, namely that of blue-collar industrial workers. Whether or not it is implicitly stated, the belief is held that the struggle against other oppressions, white supremacy, heteropatriarchy, ableism, etc., are incidental to the class struggle, to be engaged in as secondary, or that they are simply prejudices concocted by the ruling class to be dealt with, quote, after the revolution, unquote. On the other hand, we have the proponents of anti-oppression politics attempting to amalgamate, quote-unquote, class as another oppression alongside the rest, which, quote, intersect, unquote, with one another at various times and places in a person's life. Here we are presented with the grotesque notion of, quote, classism, unquote, the result of an attempt by anti-oppression theory to reconcile inadequate politics with the entirety of capitalist social relations. The School of the Americas Watch Anti-Oppression Toolkit section on classism offers a prime example. Quote, "The stereotype is that poor and working class people are unintelligent, inarticulate, and overly emotional. A good ally, a non-working class committed supporter, will contradict these messages by soliciting the knowledge and histories of poor working class people, being a thoughtful listener and trying to understand what is being said," unquote. Putting aside for a second the conflation of poor and working class, which indicates this writer's lack of insight into the matter they seek to educate about, there is truth in the descriptions of the stereotype. We are reminded of the 2010 movie Made in Dagenham, where Eddie O'Grady attempts to ingratiate himself to his wife by pointing out that he does not beat her or their children. Frustrated by her husband's lack of consideration of her struggle, Rita replies, "That is as it should be. You don't go on the drink, do you? You don't gamble, you join in with the kids, you don't knock us about, oh, lucky me. For Christ's sake, Eddie, that's as it should be. You try and understand that. Rights, not privileges. It's that easy. It really bloody is." Unquote. Similarly, for all the back-patting going on with regards to quote-unquote allies, most of what is advised and done constitutes nothing more than a minimal standard of behavior. We do not feel respected when someone in a position of power quote-unquote consults us before making a decision regarding our lives, no matter how attentive and probing they may be. We see this emphasis on listening to, rather than creating with, as uncomradely and tokenizing. In their essay, Insurrections at the Intersections, anarchists Jen Rogue and Abby Volcano address so-called classism by writing, quote, "Since everyone experiences these identities differently, many theorists writing on intersectionality have referred to something called quote-unquote classism to complement racism and sexism. This can lead us to the gravely confused notion that class oppression needs to be rectified by rich people treating poor people quote-unquote nicer while still maintaining class society. This analysis treats class differences as though they are simply cultural differences. In turn, this leads toward the limited strategy of, quote, respecting diversity, unquote. This argument precludes a class struggle analysis which views capitalism and class society as institutions and enemies of freedom. We don't wish to, quote, get along, unquote, under capitalism by abolishing snobbery and class elitism, unquote. Both of these instances of reductionism point to a fundamental misunderstanding of class and class struggle, as well as to the limits of intersectionality in understanding social relationships under capitalism. The class reductionism we should be critical of is that which attempts to reduce the class to a mere section of it, whether it is simply the poorest or the most blue-collar, and that which attempts to hold up the interests of that section as that of the entire class. The reality is that the majority of the planet is working class, and we must recognize that the material obstacles within our class and the manner by which they reproduce themselves must be attacked as a matter of necessity. Not because we are good allies or because we want to check privileges or because we want to reduce everything to class first, but because we are fucking revolutionaries and we have to. The reproduction of division. If our intention is not strictly limited to maintaining activist enclaves, we are required to look for the means to understand the development of identity and division under capitalism. In Caliban and the Witch, Silvia Federici examines the position of women throughout the rise of capitalism. With an emphasis on the incredibly violent subjugation necessary, witch burnings being an especially stark example, Federici outlines the historical process that fostered the patriarchal social relationships which uphold and define capitalism. This process is one which ran alongside the period of primitive accumulation in the transition from feudalism to capitalism. The enclosure of the commons by a fledgling bourgeoisie and the imposition of private property was the material basis for the proletarianization of populations. Without the land base necessary for subsistence, peasants became workers who must sell their labor for a wage in order to survive. Primitive accumulation is the subsumption of life into the rubric of capital, land into property, time into wages, things into commodities, and by extension the transformation of social relationships necessary to maintain and reproduce these categories. The subjugation of women to patriarchal capitalism was a crucial element of this process. The construction of the nuclear family, the assignment of domestic and reproductive labor as quote-unquote women's work, and the subsequent devaluation and erasure of that labor were historic tasks achieved through the development of capitalism. Attempting to understand patriarchy as limited to individual attitudes or actions, or somehow isolated from capitalism, regardless of patriarchal or gendered divisions of labor in pre-capitalist history, is therefore impossible. Speaking to the accomplishment of the implementation of these new social relationships, Federici writes, quote, "In the new organization of work, every woman, other than those privatized by bourgeoisie men, became a communal good. For once women's activities were defined as non-work, women's labor began to appear as a natural resource, available to all no less than the air we breathe or the water we drink." Unquote. The social, economic, and political position of women was thus defined under capitalism. This new reality meant that the class struggle, that is, the struggle for the emancipation of the working class, takes on a particular character whether or not this is recognized by its would-be partisans. Federici further explains, quote, "With their expulsion from the crafts and the devaluation of reproductive labor, a new patriarchal order was constructed, reducing women to a double dependence on employers and on men." Unquote. This double dependence thus implies that the oppression of women under capitalism is not something that is incidental nor something that can be addressed in isolation. As having particular features in the product of ongoing historic development, attacking patriarchy demands that we attack the conditions which allow the perpetuation of the social relationships by which it is constituted. As class struggle anarchists, then, we identify the class struggle as one against this double dependence as we struggle against the conditions which are necessary for capitalism to reproduce itself. Struggling at the barricades, struggling at home. In 2006, the Mexican state of Oaxaca became engulfed in a popular uprising that lasted several months. What began as an annual teachers' strike developed into a popular conflict. Baruca Calamity Peller's Women Uprising, the Oaxaca Commune, the State and Reproductive Labor, looks at the revolt and the particular role women played. The essay shows us both what the disruption of the reproduction of patriarchal social relations can look like, and how the reinforcement of those relations from within the movement ultimately contributed to its limitation and defeat. On April 1st, 2006, a march of the Cacerolas, later imitated in Quebec and across Canada, consisted of over 10,000 women, initiated the takeover of TV station Canal 9. Several hundred women from the march occupied the building, which was repurposed as a communication hub and resource to the ongoing struggle. Peller writes, quote, "Besides transmitting, producing daily programming, and holding workshops, long hours were spent during nightly patrols of the transmitter and defensive barricades in which the women of Canal 9 spoke to each other while huddled around small fires drinking coffee to stay awake. The dialogue and solidarity that emerged between the women was perhaps one of the most potent results of the takeover. What was before quote-unquote private and quote-unquote personal became a site for resistance. It was during these conversations that women for the first time experienced a space not dominated by men, in the absence of the market, in which they could organize freely and relate experiences and talk to other women. This is where the idea of women's autonomy emerged in Oaxaca, and it was to this formation of women, where there was no exploitation of their labor, no dominance of the market or the family, that the women would refer throughout the struggle." Unquote. What we find important here is the implication that the creation of new, anti-capitalist, anti-patriarchal relations requires the creation of the material basis to do so. The creation of such a basis requires the negation and disruption of the conditions that produce the old ways of interacting. Here, the occupation of the Canal 9 could be understood as what a revolutionary women's movement in embryo might look like, where the conditions were created for the creation of a new subjectivity and destruction of the former identity. In the case of Oaxaca, patriarchy still persisted within the movement. Women who attempted to challenge traditional gender roles were subjected to domestic abuse and or forced to continue to take on the full burden of reproductive labor. Rather than rely on limited class reductionist understandings, either limiting itself to the factory floor or sociological definitions of quote-unquote proles, we must strive for a class struggle which directs us towards the abolition of the divisions within our class that are necessary to uphold capitalism. We find the example of the Oaxaca uprising useful insofar as it provides us with a glimpse of both the undoing of oppressive social relationships and the defense of those relationships in a period of intensified struggle. While this section has focused primarily on gendered division and oppression under capitalism, our intention is to emphasize that these categories and identities are historically constructed and have a material basis to their continued reproduction. We see the process of their destruction as one that is necessarily part of the class struggle. To paraphrase Marx, this is the process of moving towards a class that is conscious of itself and able to act in its own interest. A class for itself. 5. Conclusion. It is our belief that the ways in which humans are exploited, assaulted, pitted against one another, and robbed of individual and collective agency must and furthermore can be overcome and replaced with a liberatory existence. While some see anti-oppression politics as contributing to this endeavor, we see these politics as a substantial hindrance to revolutionary organizing. We would like to challenge our comrades and fellow travelers to do better than this half-hearted liberal project that facilitates the reduction of complex social and economic problems to interpersonal dynamics and individual privileges. Our struggle is collective, and so too must be our tools and analysis. This has been With Allies Like These, Reflections on Privilege Reductionism, written by Common Cause Ottawa and published June 6, 2014. Thanks for reading along with me. Feel free to share with anybody you think could appreciate it.